was the 16th of October, 1946, inside the execution chamber at Nuremberg. 10 of the most notorious figures from Nazi Germany were about to face justice, men whose names were burned into history for the atrocities they had commanded. But one of them walked in with a faint, almost unsettling smile. His name, Hans Michael Frank. To the world, he was the butcher of Poland, the man who ruled over millions in occupied Poland, where ghettos starved, trains rolled to death camps, and more than 3 million people were murdered. Yet here he stood, calmly facing the gallows. What went through his mind in those final moments? Frank's life was a journey from privilege to unimaginable cruelty, from the quiet streets of Munich to the epicenter of the Holocaust. His rise was meteoric, his fall absolute, and the story of his last days and his botched execution is one of the most haunting chapters of the Nuremberg Trials. Today, we step back in time to uncover how this man climbed to power, how he wielded it with deadly precision, and how justice finally came in a way almost as chilling as his crimes. To understand Hans Frank's fate, we must return to the turbulent early 20th century, an era when Germany was a nation in upheaval. Born on May 23, 1900, into a well-off Bavarian family, Frank's early years were marked by both privilege and personal fracture. His father, a respected lawyer, offered stability, but at just 10 years old, his mother left the family, a wound that would shape his ambition and hunger for authority. After serving briefly in World War I, Frank joined the Freikorps nationalist paramilitary groups, determined to crush socialist uprisings in post-war Germany. This was a violent political landscape, one where force often spoke louder than law. In Munich, Frank became involved with the Tula Society, a nationalist and occultist circle that played a role in the birth of the German Workers' Party, the political seed from which the Nazi Party would grow. By 1923, Frank was marching alongside Adolf Hitler during the ill-fated Beer Hall Putsch, a failed coup to seize power. While Hitler went to prison, Frank fled to Italy, returning only when charges were dropped. Soon after, he married Brigitte Herbst, a union as volatile as it was ambitious. The late 1922nd and early 1932nd were Frank's launching pad. A trained lawyer with fierce loyalty to Hitler, he defended the Nazi Party in over 2,400 cases, gaining both trust and prominence. In 1933, as the Nazis seized control of Germany, Frank became Bavaria's Minister of Justice, later ascending to key national roles in shaping Nazi law. When Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, Hitler rewarded him with the governorship of the newly created General Government, the Nazi colonial administration in occupied Poland. Here, Frank ruled over millions with a mix of cold bureaucracy and ruthless enforcement. Under his watch, ghettos were walled in, food rations were cut to starvation levels, and deportations to extermination camps became a grim routine. This was the stage upon which Frank would cement his infamy, and from which his downfall would begin when the tides of war turned. Part 1. Rise to power and becoming the Butcher of Poland. Hans Frank's ascent within the Nazi hierarchy was swift and calculated. His legal expertise, combined with unwavering loyalty to Adolf Hitler, made him indispensable in shaping the Third Reich's legal system to serve its racial and ideological goals. By 1929, Hitler had appointed him as the Nazi Party's chief legal advisor, a role in which Frank ensured that law became a weapon, not a shield. When the Nazis took power in 1933, Frank was appointed Minister of Justice for Bavaria, then elevated to Reich Minister without portfolio, overseeing legal affairs across the party. He publicly argued that the judiciary's duty was to defend the racial community, prosecute dangerous elements, and interpret laws through a Nazi lens. His position gave him both prestige and proximity to Hitler's inner circle. September 1939 changed everything. Following the lightning invasion of Poland, Hitler carved out the General Government, a colonial administration controlling central and southern Poland. Frank was placed at its head. He saw it not as a temporary assignment, but as his personal fiefdom, telling his wife, "Brigitte, you will be the Queen of Poland." Under his rule, the General Government became a crucible of suffering. Ghettos like Warsaw's swelled with hundreds of thousands of Jews, deliberately starved on rations of just 200 calories a day. Disease swept through cramped quarters, while Frank's administration organized deportations to extermination camps, Treblinka, Belzec, Sobibor, Majdanek, where millions would perish. Though the SS often operated independently of him, Frank's bureaucracy enabled their work. He signed decrees, facilitated transports, and enforced policies that stripped Jews and Poles of rights, property, and life. By the early 1942, his name had become synonymous with the Nazi machinery in occupied Poland and with the industrial-scale murder that would define it. Part 2. The Warsaw Ghetto, Resistance, and the War Turning Against Him. The Warsaw Ghetto was Hans Frank's most infamous legacy. Established in November 1940 under his administration, it became a walled prison for over 400,000 Jews, a place where life was reduced to hunger, fear, and disease. Food rations were calculated to kill slowly, barely enough to keep a person alive. By 1942, over 100,000 people had already died from starvation and illness alone. Then came the deportations. In July 1942, as part of the final solution formalized at the Wannsee Conference, trains began leaving Warsaw daily for Treblinka. In just 2 months, more than 250,000 Jews were sent to their deaths. Initially, many believed they were being resettled, but as the truth spread, desperation gave way to defiance. The Jewish Combat Organization, led by the young Mordecai Anielewicz, smuggled weapons into the ghetto with help from the Polish underground. In January 1943, when German troops returned to complete the liquidation, fighters launched a surprise armed resistance. Outnumbered and outgunned, they fought for months in a guerrilla struggle against SS forces. On the 19th of April, 1943, the eve of Passover, the Nazis began their final assault. Block by block, the ghetto was set ablaze. By May, the uprising was crushed. 35,000 survivors were either killed on the spot or deported to extermination camps. The ghetto was reduced to rubble, its resistance immortalized as a symbol of courage against impossible odds. For Frank, these events marked the beginning of a shift. The war was turning. By late 1943, Soviet forces were advancing, and the once comfortable seat of the general government became a frontier of retreat. Yet instead of softening, Nazi policies grew even more brutal, accelerating mass killings as their control slipped away. Part 3. Assassination attempts, the Warsaw Uprising, and Frank's flight. By early 1944, Hans Frank's grip on the general government was under siege not only from the advancing Red Army, but from the growing Polish resistance. In January, partisans attempted to kill him by planting a bomb on his train from Krakow to Lviv. The device detonated with force, derailing the train and tearing the axle from Frank's carriage. Miraculously, he emerged unharmed. His retaliation was swift. Polish prisoners were executed, and security was tightened across the territory. That summer, resistance reached a fever pitch. On the 1st of August, 1944, the Polish Home Army launched the Warsaw Uprising, a massive, desperate bid to liberate the capital before the Soviets arrived. Frank's administration, alongside SS units, directed a campaign of annihilation. The uprising lasted 2 months, during which German forces systematically leveled Warsaw. By the end, tens of thousands of civilians were dead, and the city lay in ruins. The Soviet offensive of winter 1944-1945 sealed Frank's fate in Poland. On the 17th of January, 1945, as Soviet tanks closed in on Krakow, air raid sirens wailed through the city. Frank had already sent his wife Brigitte and their children back to Germany. At noon, he fled in a convoy of cars, abandoning Wawel Castle along with piles of incriminating documents and looted treasures. Witnesses later described the offices littered with empty liquor bottles, a grim snapshot of a collapsing regime. By early February, Frank had reached Bavaria, the place where his political career had begun. He offered his services to Berlin in any capacity, but Hitler no longer had use for him. Stripped of all meaningful posts since 1942, Frank spent the war's last months as a powerless relic of a dying empire. On May 4, 1945, just 4 days before Germany's unconditional surrender, American troops captured him in southern Bavaria. These were the same soldiers who had liberated Dachau days earlier. Forced to walk through a gauntlet of enraged soldiers, Frank broke. That night, he tried to commit suicide. 2 days later, he tried again by slitting his wrist. Both attempts failed. Part 4. Nuremberg, Remorse, and the Botched Execution. After his capture, Hans Frank was sent to stand trial before the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg, the stage where the world's most notorious Nazi leaders would face justice. Alongside 20 other defendants, he was charged with conspiracy, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. From the outset, Frank struck a tone unlike many of his co-defendants. He openly admitted a deep sense of moral guilt, declaring, "Those of us who are guilty must pay the price." Yet his defense was riddled with evasion. He claimed that he had merely overseen pacification measures, that the worst atrocities were committed by the SS beyond his control. But prosecutors presented damning evidence, decrees, signed orders, and testimonies showing that Frank's administration had facilitated mass deportations, starvation policies, and the machinery of genocide. During the trial, Frank converted to Roman Catholicism and spoke of religious visions. He was one of the few to express any measure of remorse, though many doubted its sincerity. The tribunal was unmoved. On the 1st of October, 1946, he was found guilty on all major counts and sentenced to death by hanging. His response was calm: "Death by hanging, I deserved that, and expected it." 2 weeks later, in the early hours of the 16th of October, the executions began. The gallows were overseen by U.S. Army Sergeant John C. Woods, a man with no formal execution training and a reputation for botched hangings. Frank was the fifth to enter the chamber. Astonishingly, he wore a faint smile as he stepped forward, offering his final words: "I am grateful for the treatment received during my captivity, and I ask God to receive me with mercy." The trapdoor opened, but the drop was too short to break his neck. Instead, Frank convulsed violently for 11 agonizing minutes before he finally went still. His body was cremated, the ashes scattered into the Isar River. Lesser-known facts and surprising details. Few people know that Hans Frank's story did not end with his execution, at least not in its influence. The most striking postscript came from his own son, Nicholas Frank, who became one of his father's fiercest public critics. Unlike many children of Nazi leaders who chose silence or denial, Nicholas dedicated much of his life to exposing his father's crimes, speaking in interviews, writing books, and making it clear that no family bond could outweigh the truth of history. His public condemnation served as a powerful counterpoint to the culture of denial that lingered in post-war Germany. Another little-known fact lies in the details of the execution itself. Sergeant John C. Woods, who carried out the hangings, had no documented experience before Nuremberg. Some historians believe his poor technique was deliberate, a final, grim act of retribution. In Frank's case, the botched drop resulted in death by slow strangulation rather than a quick breaking of the neck. Whether by incompetence or design, it left an indelible mark on the story of the trials. There is also the strange contrast between Frank's early arrogance in power and the way he faced his end. In occupied Poland, he had called himself King of Poland and ruled from Wawel Castle with opulence and absolute authority. Yet at Nuremberg, stripped of titles and power, he entered the gallows chamber with a smile, as if determined to meet death on his own terms, a gesture that baffled observers then and continues to puzzle historians today. These small but telling details remind us that history is made not just by the headline events, but by the human moments that live in the margins, moments that complicate the story and keep it alive in memory. Reflection and audience engagement. Hans Frank's journey from privileged Bavarian childhood to the gallows at Nuremberg is a stark reminder of how ambition, ideology, and power can converge to produce unfathomable cruelty. He was not a soldier on the battlefield, yet his pen signed orders that condemned millions. He did not load the trains to Treblinka, yet his administration made those trains possible. His crimes were committed in offices, in meeting rooms, in the dry language of decrees, proving that genocide is as much a bureaucratic act as it is a physical one. The Nuremberg Trials delivered justice, but Frank's botched execution leaves an uneasy question. Was this justice pure, or had vengeance left its shadow over the gallows? His final moments, the calm smile, the quiet words, the drawn-out death remain one of the most haunting images from that historic courtroom. And yet, perhaps the most enduring legacy is not Frank himself, but the voice of his son, Nicholas, who refused to shield the truth. His willingness to condemn his own father stands as a reminder that history must be confronted honestly, no matter how personal the pain. The story of Hans Frank forces us to look closely at the machinery of power and ask, how far would we go in service of an idea, and what would it take for us to say, enough? What about you? When you think of the Nuremberg Trials, do you see them as the ultimate act of justice or as history's uneasy compromise? Share your thoughts below.